How does someone find freedom when their body is in chains? What kind of love can heal wounds carved by human cruelty? Why did the woman who lost everything, her name, her family, her homeland, become known as the happiest saint in heaven? And what if the path to freedom began in chains? This is the story of Saint Josephine Bakhita, the slave who found freedom in Christ. A story that proves no darkness can silence grace. If you've ever felt broken by circumstances beyond your control, or wondered whether healing is possible after devastating trauma, this story will show you that no chain can bind a soul set free by divine love. Hit like and subscribe for more untold lives that turn suffering into light. In the remote village of Ogassa, in the Darfur region of Sudan, sometime around 1869, a little girl was born who would one day prove that human dignity cannot be destroyed by human cruelty. Her Daju tribal name has been lost to history, stolen, along with everything else, by the slavers who would tear her from her family. But the world would come to know her as Bakhita, meaning fortunate one. Picture the peaceful village life of Darfur before the slave raiders arrived. Children playing under acacia trees, women grinding grain while singing traditional songs, families gathered around fires sharing stories that connected them to generations of ancestors. It was a world where everyone knew their place, their purpose, and their belonging. The child who would become Bakhita lived in this security for perhaps 9 years, surrounded by loving parents and siblings whose faces she would carry in her memory through decades of suffering. She learned the skills that Daju girls needed: how to help with younger children, how to gather wild plants for food, how to contribute to the intricate web of relationships that held their community together. But this peaceful world was about to be shattered forever. The slave trade that had plagued Africa for centuries was reaching deeper into the interior as Arab raiders pressed southward seeking human cargo to feed the markets of the Ottoman Empire and beyond. The attack came without warning. Picture the terror of a 9-year-old girl awakening to screams, gunfire, and the acrid smell of burning huts as armed men on horseback swept through her village like a plague of locusts. In minutes, everything she had ever known was destroyed. The raiders were methodical in their brutality. They killed those too old or sick to be profitable, seized the strongest adults for heavy labor, and gathered children who could be trained for domestic service or worse. The little girl who would become Bakhita was torn from her mother's arms and thrown onto a camel with other captives, beginning a journey into hell that would last for years. What would you hold on to if everything familiar was ripped away from you? The forced march across the desert was designed to break the captive spirits and eliminate any hope of escape. Many died from thirst, exhaustion, or despair. Those who survived arrived at the slave markets as broken human beings, ready to accept any fate rather than face more suffering. But something remarkable was happening in the heart of this traumatized child. Instead of being crushed by her circumstances, she began developing an inner strength that would sustain her through horrors that destroyed stronger people. She learned to find hope in the smallest kindnesses, to discover beauty even in brutal surroundings, and to maintain her humanity despite being treated as property. The slave markets of El Obeid were where she received the name Bakhita, a cruel irony from a master who called her fortunate because she had survived when so many others had died. But the name would prove prophetic in ways her captors could never have imagined. Over the next decade, Bakhita was sold and resold 5 times, each transaction reducing her further from human being to commodity. Picture the slave markets where she stood on display, her worth calculated like livestock, while potential buyers examined her strength, health, and likely obedience. Her first master was relatively benign, an Arab official who used her for household work and treated her more like an indentured servant than property. But when financial difficulties forced him to sell her, Bakhita learned the fundamental terror of slavery. No matter how well you served, no matter how completely you adapted, you could be discarded at any moment. Her second master was crueler, subjecting her to the casual violence that characterized many slave-owning households. But it was her third master who introduced Bakhita to systematic torture that would leave permanent scars on her body and soul. This master's family took sadistic pleasure in inflicting pain on their slaves. They devised elaborate punishments for the smallest infractions, using Bakhita's suffering as entertainment. But the worst was yet to come when she was sold to a Turkish general whose wife was a master of creative cruelty. Picture the horror of the scarification ritual that this woman forced upon Bakhita. Razor blades cutting intricate patterns into her skin while salt was rubbed into the wounds to ensure permanent scarring. The design covered her torso and arms, marking her as property while causing agony that lasted for months. The physical pain was excruciating, but the psychological damage went deeper. The scarification was designed to break Bakhita's spirit completely, to convince her that she was not human but merely an object to be modified according to her owner's whims. But instead of destroying her, this ultimate dehumanization triggered something extraordinary in Bakhita's soul. Unable to control her external circumstances, she began developing an interior life that her captors could never touch. In the depths of her suffering, she began sensing a presence. Someone who saw her pain, understood her worth, and would never abandon her. Have you ever discovered strength you didn't know you possessed in your darkest moments? Bakhita couldn't name this presence or explain the hope it gave her. She had no knowledge of Christ or Christianity, no framework for understanding divine love. But somehow, in the midst of human cruelty, she was encountering the God who suffers with his children and who was preparing her for a freedom that no earthly master could grant or take away. Her fifth and final master would unknowingly become the instrument through which God would lead Bakhita out of slavery and into the light she had been seeking all her life. In 1883, Bakhita was purchased by Callisto Legnani, an Italian consul who needed domestic help for his household in Khartoum. For the first time in years, she found herself with a master who treated her with basic human decency. The Legnani family were not cruel, did not torture their servants, and even showed occasional kindness to the young woman they knew only as their Sudanese maid. Picture the relief Bakhita felt at being in a household where she didn't fear daily beatings, where food was regular, and where her masters spoke to her as if she were human rather than property. After years of systematic cruelty, simple humanity felt like luxury. But the most significant change was yet to come. When political turmoil made life dangerous for Europeans in Sudan, the Legnani family decided to return to Italy, bringing Bakhita with them as their servant. In 1885, she boarded a ship in the Red Sea port of Suakin, leaving Africa for the first time in her life. The journey to Italy was Bakhita's first glimpse of a world beyond slavery and violence. Picture her amazement at the ship itself. A marvel of technology that carried people across vast oceans, and her wonder at meeting travelers who moved freely, chose their destinations, and owned their own lives. In Venice, Bakhita encountered her first Italian city, with its canals, gondolas, and magnificent churches. But more important than the architecture was her introduction to a society where slavery was illegal and human dignity was recognized as fundamental. For the first time since childhood, she lived in a place where her status as property had no legal foundation. The Legnani family settled in their hometown, and Bakhita adapted to life in northern Italy with the same resilience she had shown throughout her ordeal. She learned Italian, absorbed local customs, and began to understand that she was living in a fundamentally different world from the one that had enslaved her. But the most transformative encounter was still ahead. When the Legnani family needed to travel for business, they arranged for Bakhita to stay with their friends, the Michieli family, in Venice. This seemingly routine arrangement would change everything. What she discovered in the Michieli household would complete the journey from slavery to freedom that had begun in her heart years before. In the Michieli household, Bakhita encountered something that would transform her understanding of everything she had endured: the Catholic faith. Picture her first glimpse of the family's devotions, their daily prayers, and their obvious love for someone they called Jesus Christ. The Michielis were devout Catholics who lived their faith in practical ways. They treated all people with dignity, showed special care for the suffering, and spoke of a God who loved every human being unconditionally. For Bakhita, this was a revelation that began to explain the mysterious presence she had sensed during her darkest moments. When the family's young daughter, Mimina, needed a companion and governess, Bakhita was entrusted with her care. This responsibility gave her purpose beyond mere service and introduced her to the Canossian sisters who ran a school where Mimina was enrolled. Picture Bakhita's first visit to the Canossian convent, where she met women who had dedicated their lives to serving God and helping others. These sisters welcomed her not as a curiosity or former slave, but as a beloved child of God whose suffering had prepared her for special grace. Under the gentle instruction of the Canossian sisters, Bakhita began learning about Christianity with the eagerness of someone who had finally found what her heart had always been seeking. The stories of Jesus resonated deeply with her experience. Here was someone who had also suffered, who understood pain, who had been rejected and abandoned. But most powerfully, Bakhita learned that her suffering had meaning beyond mere victimization. Jesus had transformed his own suffering into redemption for the world, and she began to understand that her pain could also become a source of grace for others. The process of religious instruction took 3 years, during which Bakhita's transformation was visible to everyone around her. The scarred young woman who had arrived, speaking broken Italian, became radiant with joy as she discovered her identity as a beloved daughter of God. When would you know that you had found what you were always looking for? But just as Bakhita was preparing for baptism, a crisis arose that would test whether her newfound freedom was real or merely another form of bondage. Callisto Legnani returned from Africa and demanded that Bakhita come back to his household as his property. The confrontation that followed would determine whether Bakhita's journey from slavery to freedom was complete or whether she would be dragged back into the darkness she thought she had escaped forever. In 1889, the question of Bakhita's legal status came before an Italian court in a case that would determine not just her personal freedom, but also establish important precedents about human dignity and the rights of former slaves. Picture the courtroom where this African woman's fate was decided by Italian judges who had never seen slavery firsthand, but were being asked to rule on its moral and legal implications. Callisto Legnani argued that Bakhita was his legal property, purchased according to the laws of Sudan and brought to Italy as his personal servant. He had invested money in her and had every right to her continued service. From his perspective, this was a simple matter of property rights. But the Canossian sisters and their supporters argued something revolutionary: that no human being could be considered property under Italian law, regardless of how they had been acquired. They contended that Bakhita had been legally free from the moment she set foot on Italian soil. The case attracted national attention, as newspapers covered the story of the African woman who was claiming her right to freedom in a European court. For many Italians, it was their first direct encounter with the realities of slavery and its continuing effects on human lives. Bakhita herself testified with dignity and clarity, describing her experiences without bitterness, but making clear her determination never to return to bondage. Her composure and obvious intelligence challenged racist assumptions about African capabilities and helped humanize the legal issues at stake. Picture the moment when the judge delivered his verdict. Bakhita was legally free and could not be compelled to return to the Legnani household against her will. The court ruled that slavery had no standing under Italian law and that her presence in Italy had automatically granted her freedom. The decision was more than a legal victory. It was a declaration of human dignity that established Bakhita's worth as a person rather than property. For the first time since childhood, she was truly free to choose her own destiny. Have you ever experienced a moment when your entire identity was transformed by recognition of your true worth? Bakhita's choice was immediate and clear. She asked to be baptized into the Catholic Church and to join the Canossian sisters as a religious sister. On the 9th of January 1890, she received the sacraments of baptism, confirmation, and First Communion, taking the name Josephine after Saint Joseph. The ceremony was attended by Venice's nobility and church leaders, who recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary. the formal entry into the church of someone whose suffering had prepared her for special holiness. But for Josephine herself, the most significant moment was receiving the Eucharist for the first time. Years later, she would describe this as the completion of her long journey home. Not to Africa, but to the God who had been calling her since childhood. In 1893, Sister Josephine Bakhita joined the Canossian Sisters permanently, marking the beginning of a new chapter in her life dedicated to serving God and others with the same love that had rescued her from slavery. Picture her taking her religious vows with radiant joy, surrounded by sisters who had become her true family and community. The transition from former slave to religious sister was remarkable for its completeness. Josephine threw herself into convent life with enthusiasm that amazed everyone around her. She performed the humblest tasks with joy, accepted corrections with gratitude, and radiated a happiness that seemed to come from an inexhaustible source. Her assignments included working as a cook, sacristan, and doorkeeper, roles that brought her into contact with visitors who quickly recognized they were meeting someone extraordinary. Josephine's smile, her gentle manner, and her obvious holiness made lasting impressions on everyone she encountered. But perhaps most remarkably, Josephine showed no bitterness toward her former captors or toward the systems that had enslaved her. When asked about her experiences, she would acknowledge the suffering but emphasize how God had used even the worst experiences to lead her to faith and freedom. "If I were to meet the slave traders who kidnapped me," she often said, "I would kneel and kiss their hands, for if that had not happened, I would not be a Christian and a religious today." This response wasn't denial or psychological suppression, but genuine forgiveness rooted in understanding that God could bring good from even the greatest evil. Josephine had discovered that true freedom came not from the absence of suffering, but from the transformation of suffering into love. What would it take to thank the people who hurt you for leading you to where you needed to be? Josephine's reputation for holiness spread throughout northern Italy as people sought her prayers and advice. She had a particular gift for consoling those who were suffering, drawing on her own experiences to offer hope to people facing seemingly impossible circumstances. Her room became a place of pilgrimage for visitors who found in this African sister a living example of how God's grace could overcome any obstacle. Children especially were drawn to her, sensing in her presence the safety and love that transcended all human boundaries. But Josephine's greatest ministry was simply being herself, a living testimony to the power of divine love to transform any life, no matter how broken or degraded by human cruelty. Sister Josephine Bakhita died on the 8th of February 1947 at the age of 78, surrounded by her religious sisters and filled with the same joy that had characterized her entire life in Christ. Her final words were reported to be, Our Lady, as she reached toward a vision that only she could see. Picture the extraordinary outpouring of grief and celebration that followed her death as thousands of people who had been touched by her life came to pay their respects. The funeral drew crowds that included Italian nobility, church officials, and ordinary people who had found in Josephine a source of hope and inspiration. But the most remarkable tributes came from Africa, where news of her death reached communities that saw in her story their own struggles with colonialism, slavery, and human degradation. Here was someone who had suffered as they had suffered but had found a path to dignity and freedom that transcended all earthly circumstances. The Catholic Church moved quickly to recognize Josephine's extraordinary holiness. She was beatified by Pope John Paul II in 1992 and canonized in 2000, becoming the first African woman saint in modern times. The ceremonies drew pilgrims from around the world, particularly from Africa and communities affected by slavery and human trafficking. Pope John Paul II declared her the patron saint of Sudan and of all those who suffer from slavery and human trafficking. Her intercession is sought by millions of people worldwide who face oppression, exploitation, and violation of human dignity. Modern applications of Josephine's story include advocacy for victims of human trafficking, support for refugees and displaced persons, and programs addressing contemporary forms of slavery. Her life provides a model for resilience and forgiveness that transcends specific historical circumstances. Her feast day, February 8, is observed particularly in communities working to combat modern slavery and support survivors of trafficking. Organizations fighting human exploitation invoke her name and example as they work to liberate those who remain in bondage. The scars that were carved into Josephine's skin as marks of ownership have become symbols of dignity and resistance. Her willingness to speak about her experiences helped break the silence that often surrounds slavery and abuse, encouraging other survivors to share their stories and seek healing. Perhaps most importantly, Saint Josephine Bakhita demonstrates that no human being is ever truly lost, no suffering is ultimately meaningless, and no chain can bind a soul that has encountered divine love. Her transformation from slave to saint proves that God's grace is more powerful than human cruelty. Her autobiography, dictated to her fellow sisters, remains one of the most powerful testimonies to human resilience and divine mercy ever recorded. The woman who forgot her birth name found her true identity in Christ, discovering that she was indeed Bakhita. Fortunate beyond all human understanding. From the villages of Darfur to the convents of Italy, from the slave markets of Sudan to the altars of the Catholic Church, Josephine's journey proclaims that freedom is not just about the absence of chains, but about the presence of love that makes all things new. The slave who found freedom in Christ continues to inspire anyone who feels trapped by circumstances, broken by trauma, or abandoned by hope. Her radiant joy reminds us that no suffering is wasted when it leads us closer to God. No wound is permanent when touched by divine healing, and no person is worthless when valued by infinite love.